Good morning. It's good to see so many familiar faces and so many unfamiliar faces. So it's good to see so many members of Chuck Margaret's family here to support them on the 50th anniversary. So I don't know, many of you probably don't know me, but when I was a young child, I was actually in an abusive home. And so until I was 8 years old, I experienced all kinds of physical, emotional, and really mental abuse. My sister's dad was really the kind of person who would punish first and ask questions later. And then my mom took us away from this situation that was abusive because it was so toxic. And she took us away to Eastern Washington. And my mom, it was a total opposite situation. My mom was kind of a flower child, you know. She was really permissive and just kind of took a hands-off approach to parenting. And so at first my situation was very structured, though kind of merciless. But then I moved to a situation where it was almost neglect. I was a latchkey kid, you know, and my mom worked all the time to try to pay the bills for us. And so I basically could do anything that I wanted. There was really nothing to stop me. And so I think that's kind of the perfect storm for creating one of the most rebellious children that you can imagine, where you go from a place that's really structured, really abusive, to one that's just completely ruleless. And that's kind of my story. When I was 16, I was quite the stormy teenager. And then when you grow up with a biological father who's more of a question mark, I think that makes it even worse. And that was how I came into being here. And so, you know, I went from a situation where I couldn't do anything right to where I couldn't do no wrong. And my mom really, she just wanted to be my buddy. She didn't really want to be an authority figure in my life or command me to do things or demand that I obey her in any way or fashion. And so I tell you all that to tell you that authority is something that is a struggle for me. It's not something that's natural. I think we all struggle a little bit with authority and its role in our lives, but some of us who've been burned by authority, we struggle even more. And I'm definitely a person who's in this category of struggling even more. I had a classic failure to respect authority problem when I was a child. And so I think, though, that it's really attractive in the church today to talk about our faith as if it's a faith that doesn't have any authority. It doesn't require anything of us. Have you ever watched a TV show or anything and seen one of the TV preachers talk about how accepting Jesus would be a lot like accepting a ticket to a cruise ship? You know, where you get all these blessings and it really requires nothing of you. And that's really not what God has for us. I mean, the beginning of the Christian life is the beginning of letting God be in authority, of submitting to God and letting Him meddle with our lives and change us and change us into being something other than what we would normally have been on our own. So anyway, you might hear this kind of talk about God as if it's if you just sign on the dotted line and everything will be great in your life. It will be just roses and lollipops and puppy dogs, and you'll walk along the primrose path all the way to heaven. And that's not been my experience, or really anybody's experience. Suffering is a part of the Christian life, and authority and submission is a part of the Christian life. To hear people tell it nowadays, sometimes you would completely miss that part. You would not expect to be a part of a community of faith that requires anything of you, or serve a God who requires anything of you other than showing up like the Rotary Club and maybe saying a vow or doing some good things in the community. But the Christian walk is a walk of submission. So submission is part of the Christian life. And it's not an optional add-on, it's a prerequisite really to a walk of faith with God. One of my favorite movies, if any of you have grown up since the 60s, I'm sure you've seen it, is Cool Hand Luke. You ever seen that movie? It's got Paul Newman in it. It's one of the best movies of all time. And in this movie, it's about this guy who goes to prison for cutting off the heads of parking meters. He's kind of a loose cannon. He's out of control. And he really does kind of a small crime, but he ends up in prison anyway. And he's kind of this indomitable, irrepressibly defiant figure. He's kind of the first anti-hero of the movies. And so he finds himself in this constant struggle with the warden of this prison. And he won't give up. Even though he's in a position of weakness and vulnerability, and everything about his life is under control, he's always harassing that control. He's always making the warden's life miserable. He's always trying to escape and get away. Even though if he just put his head down and did a couple years, he'd get out of there. Keeps compounding his sentence and getting himself in more and more trouble. The thing that I like the most about Luke and can identify the most about Luke's character is that he refuses to be defined by his circumstances. He really won't be changed. He really rises to his environment and becomes a leader. And so Paul Newman's character is one that kind of draws you in. You know, we all relate to that idea of a person who's not defined by struggle. And so, we love this kind of hero, especially as Americans. We think of ourselves as defined a people that's defined by struggle. No taxation without representation and all that. And so we look at our countries as founding, we kind of glorify this idea of rebellion and rebelliousness. And so we have embraced, I think, that sinful voice inside that says, I will never submit. I will go down swinging. I will fight no matter what the cost. Because submission is worse than death. No one can take away my rights. No one can take away my freedom. That God calls us to something far different than this gospel of defiance that we like to get from our culture. And God has little attempts, I think, to have us put in a situation where we're fighting and fighting and fighting for our rights, trying to make it about us and our struggle, and not about following Jesus. I think the call of the Christian life really is to die to our rights and to be raised again in a different form, something other than what we might struggle against, the political agendas of this world. And so we're called to die to rights and follow Jesus as example. Another one of my favorite movies, it's also a prison movie, is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Have you seen that? It's kind of a cornball movie. And it's about these people who are all members of a chain gang and they escape. And it's kind of their adventures. And there's this scene, my favorite scene in the movie is when they're all sitting down by a river and these church people come down to be baptized. I don't know if you've ever seen that scene from the movie, but the church people come down and they're all wearing white robes and they're all going to be baptized in this river. And they're singing this beautiful song. And these three criminals are standing next to the river and they're looking at what's happened. And this one guy, Delmar, he actually cuts to the front of the line. He cuts off like 100 people that are getting baptized. And he's not wearing the white robes. He's wearing these dark, dirty clothes. And he cuts to the front of the line to be baptized. And then he turns to his friends and he says, "Come on in, boys, the water's fine." And the other guy, he goes in to be baptized. He cuts the line too. And so they're both baptized, and they're mentioning to George Clooney's character, come in and be baptized, and he just kind of looks away, And then afterwards, they're in the car, and he jokes and he calls his band the Soggy Bottom Boys because they've been baptized in a wetness car on this ride. But they're talking about their experience, and I want to read for you a couple quotes from the movie here. Delmar starts out, "Well, that's it, boys. I've been redeemed. The preacher done washed away all my sins and transgressions. It's a straight and narrow from here on out. And heaven everlasting is my reward." And then George Clooney's character goes, "Delmar, what are you on about? We got bigger fish to fry." The preacher said, "All my sins is washed away, including that Piggly Wiggly I knocked over at Yazoo." "I thought you were innocent of those charges." "Well, I was lying." And the preacher said, "That sin's been washed away too. Neither God nor man's got nothing on me now." Everett goes on to tell Delmar and Pete that just because they're saved doesn't mean that there still aren't consequences for their actions in breaking the law. Then they go back into it, and Delmar says, "But they was witnesses that saw us redeemed." And Everett replies, "That's not the issue, Delmar. Even if that did put you square with the Lord, the state of Mississippi is a little bit more hard-nosed." But even though we would never say it, even though we would never, say it out loud, we sometimes think about that difference as long as we're following what God has for us, who cares what the law of the land has to say or man's rules have to say to our lives. And I think we have no qualms maybe about, say, following the Ten Commandments, but we would justify and rationalize ourselves in these other areas of our lives, these little white crimes, so to speak, where following the law of the land isn't very convenient. I mean, come on, there's nothing in the Bible about speeding, right? Well, actually, submission to the government is a part of the Christian law. If Peter can tell this to persecuted Christians like those in the picture behind me, he can definitely tell it to us in our first world situation in America. I think it's easy to separate in our minds obedience to God and obedience to the law. And as Quakers who come from a long tradition of refusing to go along with the evils of the government, I think it's even easier for us in some ways to be a little bit more rebellious, to think about that as a complete dichotomy between the law and God, obedience to God and serving the worldly governments. And so, obviously, Peter isn't telling his disciples and his followers here in Rome to go along with anything that this evil government has to tell them to do. That's not what he's doing. They're not gonna stand before God with some kind of Nuremberg defense where they just say, well, I did all these atrocities, but a government told me to do it, so that's okay. It's really not what Peter is calling us to do. At times we are supposed to engage in civil disobedience. I think the church is called to play a prophetic role in the world. We can see that in the civil rights struggle, for instance, or the slavery issue. There are times when the church is supposed to rise up and speak God's peace and God's radical different way of life into the government, to speak truth to power, so to speak. But at times we're supposed to engage in civil obedience too. There are all kinds of laws that God has zero qualms about us following. As a construction worker back in Oregon, I found myself driving from Salem to Eugene every day. And it's kind of a long drive. It's kind of a boring drive. And it was an hour and a half one way and an hour and a half back at the end of a long day. And there's many days where I was driving that road and I just drive really fast. Because there's really nothing to see. There's really no police that you're going to encounter or anything like that. And I justified my actions because I felt like I was wasting my whole life behind the wheel of the car. It just wasn't very convenient to follow a speed limit. It's like 55 and there's just nothing going on. But as I was reading this very passage about submitting to earthly authorities in 1 Peter in my daily devotions, I began to feel convicted that this little tiny sin that I kept committing was wrong, that it was no longer acceptable by God. And so all of a sudden I got this inconvenient conviction. This is a long journey. And my habit of driving 10 miles an hour with the speed limit just didn't seem okay with God anymore. And keep in mind I had no cruise control or anything to make this any easier. It was like the pedal the whole way. And I know all of you know exactly what I'm talking about because here in Iowa, it just feels like it's just flat. You can see a cop 5 miles down the road, and it doesn't matter how fast you're driving, it feels like you're going 25. That's what it feels like to me. There's no trees whizzing by, there's no hills to climb. It just doesn't matter how fast. You go 200 miles an hour, and you still feel like you're going 25. So thank God for cruise control. But I knew that justifying my speeding for my own convenience wasn't something that was acceptable. That God was calling me to a higher standard than that. And my brother, who was riding with me to work every day, he was nagging me, what are you doing? Why are you driving so slow? He had no appreciation for these newfound convictions that God was putting in my life. And that just made it worse as he kept telling me, he's like, I'll drive. I'll drive, don't worry about it. He just couldn't accept these convictions that God put in my heart. And so I'm not trying to advocate legalism here. I know that thinking about following all these earthly laws can really easily lead to this kind of system of legalism where we keep score about everything that we do. It's not really what I'm trying to tell you about today. But simply submitting to the authority of God in humility is something completely different than legalism. There's a difference between following the law when you know watching and living your life in such a way that it doesn't matter if the priest is watching. God's calling us to the second standard. In verse 13, the Greek word for submission is hupatasso, and it means to arrange under or to subordinate. It's actually a military term that means to line up underneath somebody like a general, to take their orders and follow their instructions. And I won't bore you with all the grammatical details, but it's extremely clear in the Greek that this is an explicit command. This isn't just a suggestion to Peter's context. And we're talking about a context where people are literally being persecuted for the faith in ways that the church has never imagined before. People are being fed to lions, they're being dipped in tar and lit on fire, and they're being asked to worship an emperor. And Peter tells them to follow the law, to follow these laws, even if it's this pagan, horrible government, to follow this law, unless it puts you in conflict with God. Because obviously God is the higher authority. You know, Peter tells us that government is ordained by God to punish people who do evil and to praise those who do good, and that it's to be respected and honored. Respected and honored, even as people are facing the worst persecution the church maybe ever faced. So we're to honor the emperor, but we're to worship God first of all. And this looks a little bit different when the emperor thinks he's God and thinks that you should be worshiping him. And so to these circumstances, we find this lesson about obedience to civil authorities. And it might require of us at times suffering for the sake of righteousness. One of my favorite authors spent some time in Calcutta, and he actually worked with Mother Teresa during her lifetime. And as he was kneeling next to Mother Teresa and praying with her, they were broken, they were mangled, they were ugly, the ugliest feet that he'd ever seen in his entire life. And so he would, of course, wouldn't go to Mother Teresa and say, "What's up with your feet?" But he sought somebody out and asked them, what was going on with Mother Teresa's feet. And it turns out that in this orphanage that she worked at, that people donated all the clothing and all the shoes. And Mother Teresa would find the absolute worst pair of shoes, and she would take those. She was always wearing the worst pair of shoes that they had there, because she didn't want anyone else to have to wear them. No, I think this is a beautiful picture of what enduring suffering can be a part of the Christian life. We can, like Jesus, suffer for love. Jesus is the one that taught his disciples to expect suffering for righteousness. He was the one that described following him as an act of taking up our cross. For Peter and his first hearers, many of whom were fed to wild beasts and burned to death for refusing to worship the emperor, this was a no-brainer. There was suffering for following Jesus. But I think in our time, in our culture, in our place, we have such a warped view of what suffering is. For some of us, we talk about prayer in schools. You can't pray out loud in schools anymore. And that's an act of persecution. That's not persecution, obviously. We complain that people mock us for our beliefs or they malign us in the media. That's not persecution. It's not persecution like this. People in Iraq right now are facing persecution like this. And early Christians were tortured for refusing to deny their faith. They would rather endure a horrible death than say a few convenient words of idolatry and burn some incense to an emperor. There was something about their faith that set them apart from the world, something that invited persecution. They had something that they would rather die for than lose. And I just ask, do we have that today? Do we have that kind of commitment? Do we have that kind of submission to God in our lives? It looks a little bit different in our context, but do we have that? I never pray for persecution, but sometimes I wonder why it is that no one seems to bother persecuting us. Are we doing something wrong? Are we not living into the prophetic role that God has for us as a church? Do we look not that different from a secular institution like the Rotary Club, rather than the kingdom of the living God? There's a theologian I really love. His name is John Howard Yoder, and he made a claim about the church that I found very interesting. He says that the natural state of the church is to be in exile. He basically means that the church at its best is a scrappy, small, marginalized group at the edges of society. But when the church when the church has the influence and power of acceptance by the mainstream, that it loses its focus, it loses its way, and it becomes watered down. I think we're in our time headed back to this idea of a church in exile. That as Christianity loses its acceptance and is more and more marginalized, that we are back on our way to this church in exile motif. But it's been a good news, actually, because this has a motive purifying effect on us. It takes the acceptance out, it takes that civil religion element out, and it just makes it stripped down. Makes it about following Jesus, nothing else. So rather than being driven by a political purpose or marching to the drum of materialism, we're called to be something different. We're called to be a set-apart people. And overall, Peter reminds us that as we suffer for being righteous, we identify with Christ. If nothing else, 1 Peter is an invitation to see our own sufferings through the lens of Jesus' sufferings, which is a redemptive lens to see our suffering through. And suffering can be a crossroads for us. It can be the thing that drives us into a stronger relationship with God, or it can be an excuse for us to walk away from God. We all have that choice as we suffer. And so Jesus suffered, and his example shows us that we can do so without sin or deceit, that we can do it without hatred in our hearts or firing back threats. In Jesus' example, we can learn to trust ourselves to God, and to let him be our judge. We can recognize that Jesus did something similar for us so that we could die to sin, live to righteousness, and be healed. So will you see God as sovereign over your suffering today? Will you submit to him and be sanctified and conformed in his image? Government is a thing that God has put over us, as mysterious as that is. It's something I guess we need. And as imperfect as it is, it's an opportunity to live out our witness, to be faithful and suffer and be obedient to Jesus. So will we submit to God's grace as he commands us to live obediently before a government, before a watching world, before the people that he puts in our lives that are over us? I guess that's the question I have for you today. So we have the choice to let God be the Lord or to let him be the Lord of our lives. So as Quakers, we believe that God is still speaking, that he can speak even through us. And as we go into this time of open worship, which is a time of waiting for God to move, if you feel led, you can stand and share a message that God is speaking to you. We also have these three queries that I feel God has led us to wrestle with this morning and as we go into this time of silence. Where is your relationship with God lacking submission? I recognize it's a really hard question, by the way. Where might submission to God take the form of submission to authorities that God has put over you? And have you ever seen your suffering in light of Christ's suffering? So be attentive to God's Spirit as we go into this